Can't with the dating on that date.
So far.
Yeah. All right. Here we go.
Right.
Observation 1 is a failure of imagination. War is normal and inevitable. Our history is one of wars between 2 and 3 for every year of all of human history, but we misrepresent and distort the significance of war's victory. Instead, war's meaning lies in the battle itself, Hill in 87. During the 5,600 years of written history, there have been 4,600 recorded wars, 2 of 3 years for every year of human history. The ultimate determination of historical fate, we have been taught what depends on the battle of salvation, representation of secular history neglected, and battles are exercised for the battle produce celebration. The ferocity of battle may have little to do with that term. The significance of battle is not given by war, but by the battle itself, and our American consciousness cannot comprehend the love of battle, hatred for war, and desire for wars for the sake of peace causes us to commit violence against even war itself. Hill in 87, our American consciousness has extreme difficulty with wars and fighting. Documents portray that inherent non-martial pacifist democracy Americans are idealists of wars. No place wars not dry, glorious, triumphant, creative, may have a violent people, not willing people, not our hatred of war makes us more use more violence against the war itself, wanting to put an end to stop was a major cause of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A bomb to end lives, a bomb to end all bombs, like the idea of war to end all war is bad, exterminate war, keep peace, violently war. Firepower means sure peace, reenact blind God's blindness, overkill is a way to end war. In modern society, conflate civil and military archetypal perspective. This masking of war causes us to erupt violently in our never-ending quest against delusional enemies. Hill in 87. Our immigrant dream of escape cannot fit Mars into the American utopia class for archetypal perspective, civil and military. Our language betrays bias in favor of the civil symbol by calling it civil, unlike the Roman Republic, where Jupiter and Mars can rule together. Our republic pretends to have no god of war, not even a department of war. The repression of Mars rather than ritualization of Mars leaves us exposed to the term of the repressed as rude, eruptive violence, paranoid defense against delusional enemies, and the imagination of war without the imagination of the spiritual and mythical results in dangerous literalism, making war and apocalypse more likely. Hill in 87. We do not know much nowadays about imagining divinity, philosophy, angelic imagination, angelic protection. That may be more dangerous than either war or apocalypse because that results in literalism, the cause of both the world. We know it's really living by loss and positive conscious. We imagine wars I believe that so much real God that enters wars. So this is kind of ritual positive system of wars. We have senseless, we have no mislacking, feeling the danger of breaking out, loving war too much, and not being able to bring war to a proper close, giving justification for the atomic bombs, right? Requires ritual love of God. His warriors severing themselves from his dominion, and war is a primary psychological task that shapes all of our notions about society. Unless we come to terms with war, and each of us have desire for war will lash out and push us closer and closer to annihilation. Hill in 04. We cannot prevent nor be essentially peace and strong unless we enter this level of war, unless we move our imagination to the Martian lands, or we cannot cover our support. We're not going to war in the name of peace, but rather war for wars and sake to understand the man of summer's knowledge, feeling disdain must be set aside, and phenomenon to be understood must be sympathetically imagined. Wars first of all psychological tests because it threatens the existence and value of living beings. Wars follow law being self war follows from structure of existence and our thinking about ideas of the universe, religion, ethics, falling from the higher mind from central contemplations that war tends to be expanded to peace, piecemeal by specialists or studies placed outside the mainstream look, isolated policy institutions, especially needed as an archetype psychology of wars. Deepest mind and observation 2 is dropping the bomb. The current use production of space is one of control space is utilized as a way to maintain order and sanitize war or for. Maintaining space power capacity to dominate the outer space conflict, outer space, another final protection for national security depends on identifying and destroying threat formations. Our vote is intended to make US as global empire domination of outer space requires the militarization of inner space, and outer space becomes an overview for fully militarized command force. Inner space to use construction by social ways of seeing crowd culture, heritage, social protection. Once then, once these fatally frightening the resultant politics, nationalism, language, race, gender, class, which has come in the West, places random power change role in these the mental system of psychological space can be imagined to a set of border operations aimed at the production of violence, and the movement of war up into space doesn't engage our desire to fight. We view war as a curable affliction. Hill in 04. War is neither devastating tactic and executed by skilled experts with fingertips of war, winning the hearts and minds, conversion, reason, yet more threatening is the image of distancing weapons far from the front of themselves, dissolves the woman's upward into the air, satellites, outer space style, makes war against cities, against civilians, technicians, sits in the shelter with the control panel, with the push of an order, sees to one fire missiles that can take out a town hundreds of miles away. He does not know the name of the place. He is less an actual combatant than the civilians he has killed. There's distancing in language, acronyms in places of engagement, and crashing into the ground must still be held, and the soldiers boo the dead must still be buried. War comes down to the ground, and this rejection of war is from martial into the nuclear. We cannot think forward without thinking about the nuclear bomb. Hill in 87. Civil and military imagination needs to move by its own archetype paths of not using economies, death, and mind, physical conscious, martial. It's not necessarily nuclear, nor is the nuclear necessary martial civilian. Rejection of Mars is so opposed to martial into the nuclear that we can't think war without thinking of nuclear. Not to mention figures the mystical parts of our popular nuclearism. Let's go and think about Mars, not a distinction with the nuclear. Mars do not belong to the city. The nuclear imagination calculates terms, cities, destructive fantasies, includes civilians. Mars moves in close hand in hand. The red fog of medium sea noticing the nuclear imagination of its greater distance. The Martians can take by military, literal, and concrete obstacles of geography. And this nuclear imagination results in psychic numbness and the destruction of the soul. Hill in 87, quite different from the transcendent material of the nuclear fireball, the emotional stupefaction, destruction, rather than the heightened regard for destroyed nuclear devastations. Archetype of nuclear imagination leads to human power for worse than the fall past the the soul goes in flames. The nuclear epiphany of the apocalypse, godly epiphany, the alliance, apocalypse, not part of Mars. Mars asks for battle, not wipe out, not even victory, and destroy. Psyche is the root of all violence, genocide, and extinction, the result of a soulless understanding of the word Davidson 1. A final transformation is necessary to heal this, but psyche decisions and irresistible pressure and every opportunity to destroy nothing can read the passion of self-hatred, only affect to pain, suffering, just one banish. Spectral brotherhood is that will vaporize people for a short represent this supply genocide the ego. When it's haunted by the possibility of hostile marines being genocide, the psychological destiny for this kind of psyche. And observation 3 is the role of the ballot. A, the psyche exists and comes first. The psyche shapes our understanding of the world. Everything depends on the resolution should only be evaluated on psychological qualities. Young 6. For more than 50 years, we've known there's unconscious medical psychologists furnish all the necessary empirical experimental proofs of this. There's unconscious which demonstrates influential consciousness is frivolous, superficial, unreasonable, will psychologically and hygienic to overlook the reaction standpoint of conscious thought. The psyche there would be no world of operation. Everything depends on human soul's function with brilliant. While the attention being given, it only always depends on the irrespective difference in in the equilibrium or fear of our leaders has to plunge the world into blood, fire, and radioactivity. Psychic state are observed every day can happen to anyone and refuse it to operate on the train of the psyche shows loss of soul. The state of dehumanization destroys any meaning to life and risks death, human 90. Loss of soul, never find the outer connection between humans with the inner connection to take part of society. They are needed to connection, family, total nature, gone to exposed to objects, made of who's lost soul, she has lost the courageous connection to other one, understanding the woman of her psychotic depersonation, the view of the reality of man trying to fix their soul with still delay where can do lose our souls. Each one of us, a modern man, and soul be is our interpretation. The judge should address the best psychological approach to resolution. This necessarily requires affirmation, requires saying yes to Mars, yes to exploration, and yes to the archetype of the topic of what the soul represents. Therefore, we psychologically and emphatically affirm the text. The United States federal government should substantially increase its exploration of Mars. All we have in this debate space is our imagination, our relationship with the battle. It's the most tangible form of relating that signifies an endorsement of the best sex relationship with women are after psychologically beneficial. You should vote AFC and solvency. Every ancient culture is associated with the pandemic, God of war, our modern battlefield, and the infant battlefield knows the war of God who ruled over the battlefield, Carthage 97. Everything's a complex thing, but the plan, war time, starting by relation of war, passions, populations, aspirations, identical, ways, prime on the globe, defense, especially being comments, convince, control, getting God's right, identify with precious planets, with the history, battle, and text, plan marches with the war right crowd as possible, understand the traditions, surrounding the scholar part, the concepts surrounding the red planet, point of view, correct comparison, thoughts about the culture, misfriends, stewards, for every kernel of all, many of the mystical words, that's for pizza, mom, similar level, great, mythical themes, obsession with the red planet, Mars, beyond the age, consciousness, directly attributable to the thing, they hate on the red planet with their place, this far right in the ancient traditions around the planet Mars, suddenly take on new significance, and only by embracing Mars by ancient archetypal image can be ever, where the worst ones working out, so how problem simply by avoiding them, we must sympathetically imagine them in 87. You may refer me as a warmonger, rather see me as a rammonger, Mars love shaped by Tucker's motivation, ritual imagination, constantly waking out. We may call him up and let us and say text turn aid the very principle of classification of war. Mars with features, God himself, one must approximate his effects in order to differentiate the more we love Mars the more. We can discriminate this imaginative devotion to Mars provides a mode singularized and fundamentally penetrated by archetype power specific style of love. This propulsion gives way to imagination of God and experiments in the image to experience more apocalypse that the image become fully realized real. We cannot prevent our image of the majesty depression and invoking Mars, the god of awakening, is the only way to cut through the fear and nihilism in our numb minds. When they say my thoughts are not aimed at finding another little access to how the positive reveals of God. Above, wake up, we need God, Mars, the God of awakening, so we may escape the fate of violence, death, and the harsh perspective, long for facts, and engagement with insurance, that serious light, our stand of truth, is numbered our skulls day after day, nothing at all. Mars can awaken us from this nihilism, when fear we have everything, fear except fear itself can be just a positive and listen, and form our part of policy before the start of life, our history of the world, that is the book, Mars provides penetration towards essence, pushing backward into the tangle of danger, now in the unthought of the thickest of our numb minds. Indeed, is our method, the negative will attempt to map out the topic and psychologically silence the soul within it by trying to empiricize and literalize and look at it, trying to get the upper hand the entire ethos of traditional debate, one time to fix, control, and cure problems instead of being open to the world that presents itself, the kind of archetype psychology to explore deep psychological movements and affirm our most terrorizing image of the world, human 90. When we burn ourselves when we identify with archetype fight, then we have to work furiously on the mess crap lives, remember the world likely, engage in the world of the soul to better things, the secret of archetype fight, therapies, the love of the soul presents in those things. The patient would like to make manage comes in many forms, far beyond issues of fixed control, true, the rate for beauty is down through enough human's embrace, it leads to psychologically beneficial normative sensibility and to empower and to explore, to be open to stand and wonder by entering the image of Mars, discovering his archetype project, we can metaphorically empower our conception of the red planet, human 90 is a visible connection between the image and soul. We cannot be the soul and take it with the representing soul, the image through the image, our only method can be done by us, not letting the image speak. We're suggesting the words of their arrangements, our soul minds, their archetype quality, and nurse the betrayal of the image discovery, of the necessity within the image and experience, the unfathomable analogical rhythms of the image to be noble, or empower the image with the wildest reaches and deepest possible significance.
Okay. Your first comment in 87 evidence criticizes America for thinking that war is, quote, not glorious, triumphal, or creative. One, how does America think of war? And two, how should we think of war?
America thinks of war as something to be avoided. This is constant in our foreign policy. Not only when we try isolationism, but also when we try intervention. We're all trying to avoid
How should we think of war?
We should think of war as something that is, creative and triumphal, something that is on a small scale, something that we want to enter into in order to prevent
you
war.
make the argument that America does not see war as triumphal. Do we see the end of war as triumphal?
Sometimes, but mostly it's when we see like an avoidance of war. Like he uses the example of Hiroshima and Nagasaki several times, the bomb to end the war, right?
So I guess the reason is when Osama bin Laden was killed last year, the last year of the ToC.
That was not a battle.
I remember it, but when he was killed, throughout the entire United States, there were chants of USA, USA, this like huge triumphal victory, almost this outcry.
Yeah.
It seems, how does that outcry of that celebration of victory, how does that differ?
That was not victory in a battle. That was victory in a small scale strike. That is like covert ops, all that kind of stuff. SEAL Team 6. That's different.
Hold on. Wait, hold on. Excuse me. It just seems like your affirmative makes a distinction between war and annihilation, right? You're like, Mars is good because it's not the total destruction of Earth, but other wars are bad because they're, Nagel or whatever. What does small operation strikes, what god is that then, if not Mars?
Probably Techne. Athena, maybe?
How does that make any sense at all?
Well, We don't talk about that. We defend boots on the ground, troops against troops, not sneaky little
You don't
covert
think
ops
that, you
where
don't think
Osama's in his
that
house.
counterinsurgency or counterinsurgency or counterterrorism?
Right, that's a sanitized form of war that goes to war for the
Sanitized?
sake of peace.
You think that's sanitized? Then what does not sanitized war look like?
Smaller, like boots on the ground
Smaller.
wars.
Your criticism was that it was
No,
too
not
small.
smaller, not smaller in the sense of like less men, but in the sense of obviously not, you know, every single person on the planet, but like
What
troops
is
against troops.
What does a good war
fighting.
look like, right? I gave like the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, right?
No,
I mean,
those are
they're all
sanitized
bad.
forms.
okay, what does a good war look
Oh,
like?
when Caesar conquered the Gauls, I'm a fan.
When Caesar took over the Gauls
Yeah, that is what I said. No,
and then he
that is-
enslaved them afterwards.
Not really. They
Yes,
made them
really.
into
Yes, really, that's what
Made-
happened.
Okay, they made provinces out of Gaul, and really this is not.
Yes,
what
and when
we're
they
at.
shipped the Gauls off to Rome
To become slaves in the
Crassus.
Colosseum. You know, like, not the Colosseum.
Yeah, they are not doing that.
Dude, you're arguing that the best form of war is when we enslave the local populations? to be
Dude,
our
that is
servants?
not what we're arguing.
Then
We're
tell me what a
arguing-
good war looks like.
Okay.
What is a good war?
A good war is one where victory can be attained and is glorious, triumphal, and
Like
clean.
what?
Look, I'm not going to be able to say like this war.
So you're like, we should imagine war, but I don't know what the good wars are?
No, we can. That's why we need to imagine it.
You can imagine it.
Wait.
Yeah, hold on.
Tell you what, I just got really late. One way to do it. Ready?
What's that, sorry?
You guys.
Okay, I'm good.
Hold on. I'm just gonna scoot up there and get the cards.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, we're tired of paper.
Set up a station or something first.
Yeah, I'll just.
I'll try to remember to flip your way.
Oh yeah, it's fine. I'll get this one.
Alright, ready? First up is the K, the logical security necessitates all possible violence, the point of annihilation can't blame. Security in your person numbers is the nature of the world, not truth about who we are, who we are, and who we are not the church, so the devil of God. Produce reactivation with that produces his own age. We can witness this operation masculine in the 20th century from 1914. When he bears high cost of Vietnam, the menace of the over the upper increasing use of terror and torture. Should the goals for research and security, exploitation of resources, protected to apply to serve these ideals of creating order, self against an order, world search to become dirt, become material into the new normalization, correction, discipline, towards the nature of play discourse, strategies against the other, and our love of war is a social construction, not an internal archetype of reality, challenging social condition, violence, loss for political elements, and war stir. Whom easily partially ready, we might have a terrible love of war, we all have other loves. Confess an unshakable love of peace, and not sure the love is archetypal, universal chapter writ. Peace away turning hearts into wars, the hearts of peace is proving difficult for individuals to play. One day, self secretary wars, cultural or usefully social self. We see the self-spice society wars, peace, are social conditions, the way peace is active social tradition, humiliation of the oppression, domination. We need social change, we may discipline ourselves to become more often more hateful. We engage in social action to foster harmony, we should focus on changing the conditions. Call for action on the love of war. And the one I see is part of a process of linking war and politics, framing debate, a society of war making now is not going to magically prevent wars in the future. Rather, it promises to live in real war every time. Go for the ballot. Paragraph 11. Media focus on the prime, the moment's reaction and interpretations, without reading on instead of mental train tracks, or reality exactly the same yards of human brains, malleable thoughts above the material structure, the brain memories, and conscious act, and pursuing conscious in pathways more often, you go for things in connection, the more likely you call them. The future, your ballot is the currency, debate, vote for analysis of their money sees catastrophic propaganda, decrease the political salience of their psychosis, and sorry, 5. It's all the woods and how the OPRF system lays concrete foundation. We must recognize the truth about why the system is false and enslaving us. We should be the battle against in our hearts that open the beholder and extends those who open the information and having war. The brain empirically makes populations more vulnerable, being successful in manipulating and intervening in conflicts. Will cast 5. When presenting international conflicts, the domestic audience wants to make the press emphasize the threat. Same public opinions of the events taking place in simple ways to make the public feel like they're threatening or evil. She's recruiting a number of threats to security in Germany. This regional implications again wider international support during the First World War and university propaganda. Influence American opinion is always necessary to conflict. They continue. Reiterate the threat made known domestic international diplomatic opinion. And the political debate is already saturated by violence. Resist the continuation of militarization of the debate space. Journal 314. Except for violence accelerating the large society now rules a growing case for violence can be seen in the increased models of unlawful public schools after prison violence is saturated every left. The consequence of a disastrous schools numbers of multicultural prison students being criminals here. Upon the edge of the government through crime ethic groups. Just in centuries late every day left the violence of punishment inflicts pain on the psyche, the body, and dead people's heart. With respect to the some yearly barbarism or ratings and form, it's a blatant indicator to the degree which sadism and infatuation with violence become normalized society that thinks of delaying humanism itself. And will we advocate for war, we instead argue for our surrender. Our alternative is vulnerability. We recognize our inevitable vulnerability. We affirm the ethical political community. Our alternative opens the space necessary for ethical politics. Well, for we must turn off violence, living in with fear of the planet where we open a future of infinite war. The word name of the word here is well, with vulnerability. Other than this, we can prevent because highly sensitive and certain conditions of mindfulness. Vulnerability be the basis of military solutions. Just not vulnerability fuel war. We cannot will be this vulnerability. Let's think about what politics might be like. Say vulnerability is such thing we learn from distribution of vulnerability from our social is something we gain. Maintain group is part of the framework between our international ties, right? With the most important the resources which find a way to make room for resources to be developed in identification with suffering. We might have those conditions that our certain lives are more vulnerable than others and more grievable. Are vulnerable to violence. And there's no scientific basis to assume war is inevitable. Lesser 6. And which is specific behavior can read backwards into evolutionary and attempts to rationalize by explanation for behavior tend to carry forward. Assumption bias given human nature, drawn back from knowledge like human society, sociobiologism, and conservative political scientific tool. Systematic for legitimate things, say other such arguments, naturalist behaviors, and supports discriminating structures to specific behaviors. Natural concludes possibly that human actors should make choices avoid natural argument against egoistic human nature, as number simplification of classic Darwinism. Figures seem to be constructing all of that using sociology humans. The mental dominance hierarchies, yet these possibilities don't suggest that humans give allegiance to state under second dominance hierarchies, not naturalist ubiquity. Biologists expect whether sociobiology can use contemporary humans because they're all playing with self-regulation activity. Determining human behavior, humans demonstrate an inherent tendency towards cooperation traits, like aggression, seeking work by cultural transmission that genes many of the scientific foundation they are in place to support its epistemological program. Indeterminate extent explain why cultural or environmental factors play a role. Evolution of science does not support realist narratives. And our advocacy moves towards a new model of global relations. The formulation of our global community is a peaceful one. 194. Do you want me to read just the shorter highlighting?
Yeah.
Naturalism is a function structurally considered constituted in its identification will rarely be capable of having such determining actors or rational. Anarchy may be a selfless system, may also be collective security system. Anarchy appearance is different from one of enemies of state, friendly or respectful attitude to the encounter. Criminality of identity formation may ensue. But whereas the discursive structure states of conflicts there exist in not creating room. Rest positive identification, think although repeated acts of reciprocal cooperation, actors form mutual expectations, able to incorporate this occurs unintended consequences of actions or withdrawal. Concentration, actor will gradually change his own elites, but who it is. Next up is death toll. One he sees introduction, death and vaccine debate is bad. One trivialization, death debating causes a static fascination with the spectacle of death. This turns between death call denies the choice to avoid death impacts. Jumbo 93. Death and vaccine debate no reality takes on the mask of rationality. The dominance of humanity is everywhere become an object of contemplation of self-alienation, research degree, experience of destruction, aesthetic illusion is the very form of fascism, pushing the acceptance, culture, death, and point of tribulation, produce the experience of rational administration. And mostly exploiting finalities. And the two is body counts, death debating reduces people's lives to mere numbers for debaters consuming their game. Budget 93. Everyone's already dispossessed of their death. The principles of criminal realization of life must be reduced to quantity of death. Nothing decision withdraw they live in according to the social BCP death is conceived as all great death. Secondly, neutralize the victims and scrap their world calculation planning or programming. Must we also operate the death as a social service under the sign. The plan of evil negative because they have introduced death to max the debate cushion to 80. Within the educational system, the task is to know how and when decision we made to distinguish between what should and should not be done in analyzing death, interpreting every significant nuance of events of the cause of those who develop the meaning of life and see this a gateway argument how we should have been allowed to debate. When they can use death and max to the rest of one you see applies. We don't want to make cross applications from other.
No, it's fine.
Right. Case. Their role of balance is that either the psychological framework is a perpetual internal police state that makes our life suffering. Robinson 5. Two opinions of political and economies around postmodern saying for essentials of the constitutive life, stand endorsement conditions, the new consumption of assets, constitutive life, is the partition myth, is the function myth, so the anti-fascist fact, the same particular ideological people rejecting any need to argue for something that the status constitutive life is supposed to affect the explanation, ontological, and accessible myths, making tricky for contribute their aberration is a conflict with the social context, so for some social function carrying in order to think they're opposed to the company disorder, the theory involves prior structural matrix sound with the change, when since in which occupy the most cooperation, the constitutive life is supposed to the only rhetoric is the enunciation, this language now, which is supposed to silence critics, not to think well, it's accepted of one day, so she can still be told. It's like so much information theory critics are being dangerous, being wrong, this basic and operation is anti-analytical, the analytical schema, fixed in events of the expressive, like when having some locality analysis of specific political phenomena, either psychological normativity is violent control, that's fine, as McDay 92. Contemporary society and social norms of the mystery sees as directive structures, laws, and science, individual content, almost one of modern ethics or insights because they can be running how scientific knowledge itself, desiring the unconscious mind of power after expect living to have arrived at the truth, the individual living individual displays, every looking at raise the individual pose the truth and normalizing tendencies of power, to behind individualization and endless examination, once in yourself, self-knowledge, critical coercion, the most pressing political circles to struggle, gets regulated and deliberating power of psychoanalysis of loose reasons, serves to implicate individuals, even the disciplinary analysis, managing the urging quest not only perceived as course, but as regarded self-liberation, disclosure of the yourself, and unconscious desires lead to more pressure, regulation, normalization through self-policing subjects, confessing subject is the instrument of domination. Back to the K. Our individual critical alternative is key rupture point in the narrative security discourse, law 7. The result is these security is that humans are relevant for discussion of their security critical theories, not for simple solutions. There are no traditional alternatives, but next powers always in part. Traditional knowledge and discourse make powerless through discourse practice objective reality. Say once it's time we define our reality, we say crime cause repeating the values of civil society. Against the state responsible to U.S. knowledge, national security state, nor dissenting section. Criminality, the guards in the Vietnam War, there's no pragmatic application critical theory. International relations in which is born a new collective identity called war. I must know parents of part that the clubs in the United States have been moving towards a more useful future. The world is not existing in Africa, nasty bridge from international relations are subject to change. The investigations respect over percent and many which should be utilized for technical goal setting. Yeah, cross-reference.
Okay, I guess we'll start at the end. So the last piece of evidence you read, the law evidence, says that critique alone achieves enough of a break from repetition of failed politics and violence. How is your form of critiquing different from ours, and why do we not achieve
Yes, because your critique endorses violence, has a false idea of an ideal war that we can pursue, which is really the narrative that's surrounded every war the United States has gone to forever, and probably every other country.
Right, actually, wouldn't you think that most of the wars we've gone to have been in the name of preserving peace, or actually, just sort of getting nasty war over with so that we can go back to our peaceful, lovely existence?
I mean, obviously that's a component of it, and I think it would be a component under your framework as well, but we think that the argument that there is a beautiful existence of a war, and that war can be filled with discourses of triumph. Every war we have seen has been filled with those discourses of triumph.
Okay,
we're winning the war, we're
we
chanting nationalistic chants, we kill Osama bin Laden.
That's fine, thank you. We would make the argument that those discourses of triumph are focused on the fact that we can return to peace. That's neither here nor there. Let's talk about your role of the ballot. So the role of the ballot, I can't read this. Could you read that?
Yeah. Oh, you just said your role of the ballot is bad.
Yeah, but you had like a specific reason. It was like psychologically forcing people to do something.
The McNay card.
That's actually the Robinson card.
No, you're wrong. It's the McNay card.
The first card? She's talking about the first card.
Okay, it doesn't matter that much.
The warrior thing is in there.
Oh, it's in the red.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's essentially that your framework, like your normative framework about how a psyche should operate, causes individuals to police themselves, to always think they need to be within your ideal framework, like this is the way the human mind has to work, and it has to work this way always. And B, allows for social forces to construct discourses of what constitutes a healthy psyche,
that's
and
fine.
use that
That's
to
fine.
normalize the way that people behave.
Can you explain your militarization of the debate space arguments?
Sure. Well, which ones?
I don't know, the ones you made on the K around the center, just like the argument that you made.
Yeah. Essentially, that argument is that the debate space is obsessed with the military, and that's probably not a good way to debate. Is there anything more?
Like our argument is also that the idea that we can have a love of war, like that assumes that like debate is this like closed area. Part of our argument in the block is going to be that debate is not this like in the one I see like as debaters all we can do is imagination. No, this is an area for activism in many ways, and part of our argument is that assumption that we're just here to play a game has dangerous implications.
Right,
Our argument says that when we assume that we can just play this game.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, on the death K, what are we supposed to debate about if we don't have death as an impact?
Sure, you can debate about material conditions, you can debate about things that make people happy.
Social inequality.
Right,
Social
and
inequalities.
you guys were just talking about how debate is important because it's key to activism. Isn't part of that activism being able to talk about what policies might have some of the worst
I
possible
feel like these are operating on
consequences?
another level that you're not realizing. The first is more of a theory argument about debate as such as it is now. When debate operates as a game, when we use like death impacts as a currency in that game, that trivializes that death matters. It makes us not
That's
see
fine.
the atrocities
Take
that
it
are
back.
happening in what we read as our impact cards.
Thank you.
Right, so, okay.
I guess to answer your question before, I don't think death impacts need to be part of our activism either.
Yeah.
Okay, we have 647.
Or do you take prep time for jumping?
No.
Oh, you finished, I'm sorry.
Like, what was it? Like 6:47?
647.
Cool.
You a viewer?
Please flash it a little. Or remember the doc.
Oh, right.
But here's this one. There's another one.
Speech to exceed, the only final one. It says starts with A2 Rob. Okay.
So it'll be the case flow, security flow, death flow.
One second. Sorry, I'm sorry.
You guys good?
Yeah.
Okay. Judge ready? All right. Case on the same psychoanalysis bad, but they never contest the actual existence of the psyche and that it shapes everything we do. If we with that the psyche is real, then it shapes everything we do. Then psychoanalysis is a prerequisite to do anything else. And you evidence indicates that the unconscious influences every single action we do, which means when we have to look at the unconscious in order to make sure we have good actions. They say Robinson, but Robinson is wrong. He lumped all psychoanalysis together. There's key differences between authors. Him is in the final he studied under Jung from Thomas 4. Robinson tells us that in similarities suggest a single approach. We are within the integral Robinson could sense some nature, quantity, or private or run specificity of form. There's important difference between the theory syndrome. But Robinson, one was capitalist, but when the United States in the paradigm, and also none of their evidence applies to our form of psychoanalysis. Hillman doesn't try to advocate a traditional form of psychoanalysis where the psychoanalyst tries to discover what's wrong with the patient. Instead, he believes that each individual should examine and identify with the contents of their own psyche, which means another arguments that we have this normative kind of approach applied. We think each individual should look at their psyche and discover what is there. We're not saying that there's only one way to look at the psyche. Just that we have to look at the psyche. We have to embrace the psyche, or also all of our impacts on our next to security. First, our method is better than K. Recognizes the same problems as the one I see, but they are a form of lazy intellectualism. They don't actually do anything. When we have a method that tries to figure out why these impacts are playing, we try to take an active approach at doing something about it. Second, is framework. Extend our interpretation that judge should address the best psychological approach to resolution. All we have in this debate space is our imagination and our relationships. The battle signifies endorsement of the best type of relationships. If we win, our plan is psychologically beneficial, and you vote F. Extend our cross apply by extension from the U. Evidence above and the psyche. Precedes questions of security. The ability to think about how we act is wired in the unconscious, and term mutation to both and threat and enemy distinctions are good and devil due to the difference of others, but this is an extra link. Instead of dehumanizing depiction, we respect the enemy from Rash 3. The new making had a different chance to manage a total inclusion, solve people more than special life enemy security to glorify what a judge making determination about total inclusion. The other will include the others excluded, which not help to drop enemy single war record services to warfare by other means, and attempts to solve war have always failed because war is ingrained in every human being. Every planet and war is barely registered new generations of battles. This is the reason why our discussion war is key from Helmet 4. War is not a product of reason, not yield reason, peace, institutional implementation, the war is still gone, a massacre, many terribly everyone cannot be held in rational agreement, the reasonable language is telling the divorce, words go not expand, the range and opposite, and make the process of war is rapidly and slow and safe, and hatred of war can never solve the use of love and violence, non-violence, also reality, because pacify on senators who are unable to natural change from Helmet 4. Love is not narrated, war, love is not possible, cannot be negative, love is the third department, not love to see the great virtue, place of action, love to the city, ancient, big, jihad, white Russian, instance, 7. We require an enemy which the next seeks to eradicate a never-ending mission to establish a peaceful utopia that destroys value life. We love the enemy because he drives us to battle from Helmet 4. War requires imagine anything bigger than the enemy conditions, patch of hatred, to burn and destruction, love practice, the supercharged trick that makes the battle feel possible. Imagination is the direct voice, dead enemy, this existential growth, angel, God, or other food, so continuation for a genuine current need. And the all can solve the human ontological condition is one of items from Rash 5. Liberal theory continues to use the normally coding of fabulous political power displacement in terms of economics morality. Liberal theory denies the enemy by finding in nature good. In such a state, the nature of violence would have to be exerted by even greater violence. The political honesty of results only after the fall of things to make the superfluous for restored. War because of the establishment of the first term of the natural order peace and so fulfilling prophecy arguments are true to appear to express their fears that cause them to occur in 1895. The service is indicated on reality, people have to speak exactly like habit, the character is near the truth, precisely what we repress and disruptive behavior in this situation, might make unconsciously happens outside of fate, and there is no root cause of war, as a collective force we much imagine from moment forward. Word belief, imagination, usually counters from all our views towards meaning and the search of ethic made the cause of only method of accidation and number of law with the search war, with the right collective force beyond human will the task. The task is to mention they say their own liqueurs stir evidence, but this doesn't actually link for them. It doesn't say the war is inevitable, just that certain signs of war we address and we try and we dread those certain signs of war that they those 6 kinds of war that they say are unnatural and there's something that we will be able to solve for. Also, we are the best. We end up solving the alternative best by entering into embracing war. We can enter into vulnerability only instead of ignoring war, but embracing it and going into it. Then we can feel vulnerable, and then we don't enter into wars in the future. That's why it's key to embrace war in round and without embrace the Marsden state will inevitably be paranoid and securitized from Hell 90. From here, the convention of script and the paradise, the script and the paradise, it is like the deeper the prediction of the essence of social human ideology, these regular, the conscious paranoid changes with the commerce of paranoid negotiating the potential world out of the state, we can simply defect the self-defense, the isolation, spectrum, what is the interference, harmless effect, the propagation, nation state, but the nation state is inherent, pillars, paranoid, cautious, mistrust of the god, the pillars of the politics, and knowledge of the political electing, therefore, we receive their exchange for arbitrary caution, disrail, this obsessive illusion, lead for security, paradoxing, takes to the defense mechanism, reaction, reaction, and the effectiveness of it, scripture believes that probably the fact catastrophe takes more measures that may be more little than forming catastrophe lists several words. That catastrophe is a policy, the measure statement, the parent, preliminary, sorry, I have to read one more part from this later. And they say science says the word isn't inevitable to be. Sorry, but when their approach to science of positivism is bad, then Hillman says that this approach to positivism and literalism instead of trying to erase the mythical is what makes wars are likely makes us able to bring war to a close. Additionally, all of history proves that wars are inevitable. There have been 2 to 3 wars for every year of recorded human history. It's not going to and one alternative and just trying to erase vulnerability. They say we're not to go. They say we were in activism, but we are activism. We say that you should enter into imagination of war. So our virtue later, this is going to approach everyone in this room can endorse enter into imagination of war, and that will solve problems later. Go on to the death argument. First, Baudrillard's politics are rather deeply conformist claim of peace, a high reality told by the system that just several alternatives you feel like an outlaw critic actually posed up that the system from Don one. Baudrillard misses shaking about what they get to the 16 and realism is short. Second about the flow of images, understanding the joy, the narcissistic shadows, the rule, namely leaders, and radical conformity of itself and politics, based on the chance that reversibility is life destroying gear, and teeth domination because glorifies passive consumption and indifference from Johnson 10. All against the socialist ideals of claim the disillusioned passivity reminds outlaw system controlled by itself, but this is not so much attack the mirror as they control the sincere masses of the world, makes up the radical difference, but not the one becomes the pioneer irreversibility, fortune, mirrors, and intent, cold fixation, which put Baudrillard so adores Mark the card adores, and also we're not, we're critiquing, we critique the same thing, we say that war shouldn't be a set of images planned out of screen, but something, something in the media, but with something which enter into imagine coming forward. War TV movies play video games outside the terrible Netherlands effectively stop turn off the still operating up there so like people models and they're providing on models for measuring reality war TV becomes a truth description only by entering into war can we truly discover psychic beauty from common 90. The only being psychic is after did not have to come to our is the queen of dead souls sustained the bringer the structure of the possibility psychic system unless that's the other world cannot be seen as such as the depth of the text cannot be psychic must let yourself to experience the reality of this meaning this would be the ultimate task so making the incorporation is can involve life of video transferability of eating. Keeping the psyche of the kid during the morality that takes other. Moving over this understood is tempered by personality of her depot.
We're taking a second.
What were the last two parts?
Oh, hold on one second, Brad.
Wait, were the last two arguments made on the K or on the? You went back to the K, or this is all of it now?
Just one more.
Okay, yeah, stop, Brad, 20 seconds, use.
You got 10:43 left, or 9:43 left.
Just real quick before we start cross sects, if you want the book, this pink sticky is on deck. Here, I'll put this one outside too. And
What-
this one is on security.
What was the tag on the security one?
I mean, I can't, tell
This
you
is
exactly.
security?
What is this, sorry, can I see this?
Do you mind if I read it? I'm sorry.
No,
This-
go
that was
ahead, you're
security.
good.
Okay.
What was your other question?
Alright, wait, the last two arguments you made, what were they? Where were they? On the flow? Was this was getting the death argument or on the,
The last two were on deck.
and it was the part about, like, hyperreality, and what was before that?
Do you need?
Oh, we critique the same thing or something?
Yeah, we also critique war because we want meaning to it, which gives meaning to the death that you
that's
guys
fine.
critique.
Alright, that's fine. Okay, sure. In the context of the way you're trying to spike out a reference on case, where we're like, oh, we don't say that everyone needs to be the same or whatever, or everyone out of psychoanalysis totally individualist. How can you read that and then like read cards in the K that are like, human ontology is necessarily violent? Like it seems like there's a massive contradiction because on case you're spiking out a reference, we're like, no, we're not prescriptive. We don't have we don't say there's a universal psyche, the universal way that operates. But then on case, it's like.
I think it's a little different. We say there's certain, we have certain, well, there's two types, in Jungian psychology, there are two types of an unconscious. You have your personal unconscious, which is different for everyone, and you have your collective unconscious, which would include our archetypes such as war, God of Mars.
But, I mean, I don't understand how, like, saying that there's a
There's
collective unconscious,
right,
still a
there's some
prescriptive way
things
that
that
people,
There's some things about us that are
individual.
individual we can control. There are some things about us that we cannot control that are part of our species.
Alright, you got a link, that's fine. Alright, you say that you embrace vulnerability by going to war.
Yeah.
Explain that one to me.
Out in battle, when I enter into my imagination of battle and fighting, I feel pretty vulnerable.
I thought we were supposed to feel triumphant in war
After you win.
after you win. Alright, great.
I can feel vulnerable while feeling triumphant. I don't think
You
it's
can? Explain that one to me, please.
I mean, I can feel triumphant in like the victory and the power and the adrenaline of the moment, but I can feel vulnerable when someone's coming at me with their fist or
What's
their
a
sword or
good
their...
war? Do you have an answer to that one yet?
As my partners try to explain, good war is one where we're loving war for war's own sake. Battle for the sake of battle. We don't try to sanitize it through things like nuclear
But
weapons.
it's never happened before in
drugs, or-
history.
No,
Or-
we said Caesar and the Gauls.
Are you really, through the 2 hour, when you defend Caesar versus the Gauls, the Gallic Wars is a good war?
Why? I
The
don't
massive enslavement of like the
that was an
people?
aftermath of the war. Probably not ideal. We'll have to navigate that.
Okay.
But, I mean, while he was
We
at
can
war with the
laugh all
Gauls,
you
oh
want,
wait, okay,
but
wait,
the-
listen, while he was at war with the Gauls, right? The Gauls are basically fighting shirtless and like with rock weapons. The Roman army, fully armored in swords, that's a good war where we can just like
I don't think you
roll
realize
people
the
because-
Gauls also love battle. The Gauls also went to war all the time.
Yes,
It
but the
wasn't
Romans were
like
technologically
Romans, hey,
hundreds of
we're
years
gonna
ahead
go
of them.
out and
Like that's trying to do good war is like one side is technologically ahead of another and just rolls the other because it seems to
Exactly.
turn all your Jones arguments.
We're good. Yeah, we'll take the drop.
527.
Left.
Yes.
Go. Criticism case.
Okay.
Not. Good night. Good.
I don't know any preference. There's just no underline on here. If you want to make preference, what did you read?
I read the bracketed paragraph to the end of the sentence that goes on the next page.
Okie dokers.
Come again. 10 things of prep. Yeah, first question.
Sure, I'll take option A. Okay.
I just want to be technical.
9 to 17.
Okay. Ready? All right. If I come off as slightly abrasive during this speech, I'm sorry, but you should keep in mind, in the context of their argument of an argument for the love of war, they have conceded the thesis of our Campbell evidence that the discourses of danger and necessary state, the logic of total annihilation, we mobilize populations for the sake of war because we think of people as disposable. That is the thesis of their 1AC, their entire argument that we should valorize war, that war should be something to be celebrated. That is the logic of the modern security state because we have the assumption that people exist only as objects for tools to be mobilized for the war and to be validated. It's very easy to say that war should be something to validate when you are not the one being taken apart, when you are not the one that is suffering at the hands of the military and industrial complex who causes things like structural violence externally, which is what our true evidence is in the context of how the militarism is the form of sanitation for American politics now. The line debate, you should group the first argument about the first argument and the second argument about the Maneuver method. They conceded the thesis of our alternative, which is our Butler argument, which is an embracement of vulnerability. Humans, necessarily, even though we might all be different, we are all have a shared universal understanding, which is being in a state of vulnerability, which means that in any scenario I can do harm to you and you can do harm to me. Our argument is that the recognition of that vulnerability and recognition of vulnerability and turning can't say for instead of valorizing war, realizing that war is a better way to achieve a form of non-public thing conceded. Our law evidence that says that it's possible to rupture the notion of the national security state that is able to change this from the discourse of the national security state. They've also conceded the thesis of our Wendt evidence will be pretty damning on the question. Our Wendt evidence is a historical approach and says that the more friendly reactions we engage with people, the more likely that those reactions would result in positive relations with the people. He cites that while the Cold War was a large project, it was also a discursive project in the manner in which reciprocal acts of kindness have brought the United States and closer together. The apartheid in Africa did indeed end, which proves the thesis that there's a manner in which we can articulate a way to limit the amount of wars that exist in the world, which is the thesis as to why our alternative that's very good. They say that you should celebrate war. Argument is you should celebrate surrender, giving yourself over to the other, which is why our attitudes are necessarily mutually exclusive. So now the next argument is a framework about the best psychological approach. Necessarily, the arguments like case or impact turns to their framework and why their framework and why their necessary. But our interpretation is that you should hold the 1AC to the dangerous ramifications of their thoughts. It's debate is a game, but it is not a joke. They aren't given some ability to debate in a vacuum. All of their impacts are important in regards to winning the game, but there are real implications for advocating a love of war this round. They assume that debate is an area to think, to plan, and construct future policy. That is exactly what policymakers do, which means if we win the thesis of our link arguments, that when they go into the real world, if they become policymakers, then they'll form planning a game where they assume that everything is a game, means those impacts necessarily spill over. They are nothing different than American policymakers who relish in war opportunities. There are new things to find to attack China, new weapons to gain. The military-industrial complex keeps on growing, new targets to fire upon. These are engaged in the same form of scenario planning that the 1AC is necessarily engaged in. Also, you should prefer the specificity of our evidence debate changes as regards people. That's Bureau in 93. I no longer separately involved in the debate for the rest of my life as a individual. God, I lamented from debate community death culture to debate yourself, bringing back arguments from morbid and detached fascination with such events and one views the human tragedies as a part of the game. Rounding arguments will carry them to goal when they turn X or Y or Z. The use of such events in the ways of attempt much for celebration of that language is not really transparent, true transfer information for the credit for me the wish is that the real women to do a consequence language use replication. How we do the world, how we do others, how we act in the world. Women and the women debaters are marginalized and rendered violent and such as good community. Women labeled bitches who are not, and so she suffer for women to be verbally aggressive. Women labeled as hysterical as members of this community. We have great freedom to define ways we go. This is a debate. It's a collection of shared understanding or explicit or implicit interactions. We may be able to change the world, but we may not be able to change the world, but we can change our own community. If we fail to do so, we've given up the only real power they have. Their next argument is that we are necessarily wired for war. They conceded the thesis of our Butler evidence, which is much better than theirs. That assumption is necessary valid. They medically assume that we are geared to war because they spied out that we did war, but our argument is that is necessarily a multi-discursive project. Our argument is the best empirical studies and scientific studies. It's actually Let's look at war. Now, the next argument is the red argument. First off, history is on the other side. The framing distinction did nothing. You limit balance between the thesis that I read about the idea of a good, just war. That even is a single characterization of that. And then that is the reason why this is bad. More importantly, this presupposes the idea of a sovereign to a set identities, which laws for the state exception. If you got in 98, the camps were filled in Churchtown, Room Camp, full of camps. The state of exception over the camp with his own industrial society. That's how World War produced the real life, which came in damage, which transformed all threshold, and which all kinds of the fact that no one expressed these particular view more clearly the restrictions of genuine security, and this state of nature which refers to a rude but situation of absolute delusion of the law that be able to regulate the cases. Every war is a bad war that Karl Marx. And the inherent substance of what you see was that, oh, there's a good form of what here, and only we can't return to that. The one, if given one example of that war where their interpretation of a good war is conquest for conquest's sake. The war is never ending. We go on a war just for the sake of expansion control. They are right, and that it's just a Gallic war, but the result of that was the enslavement of the Gallic people, the complete murder of their population. This also characterizes German expansion and United States soldiers in Afghanistan relishing against the battle against the enemy, which means inherently they are just as likely to result in dehumanization of the enemy because they assume that there's something to be gained, something to be loved in slaughtering other people. The next argument they make, is the question of a war being violent. Our evidence is much better. The evidence is much better. The question of that science is at our side first. They conceded our Wilcox evidence that they're planning for war actually makes it more like it takes an empirical view that the way Hitler was able to mobilize the German populations was to instill the idea of a perfect security state at all times. The thought of war was always ingrained within them, which made it more easy for the German population to get murdered. The second is our Fairhurst evidence, which also conceded. Our argument is that when the media first constructs the idea of war, that lays psychological primings. We continue to associate politics with war with politics, which means when they, the makers, they are more likely to result in war. Our evidence is actually scientific, that their very statement about war makes war more likely. That's our run Apollos 5. Living beings emit waves. The effect of psychological behavior is stronger. The effect of active people. False physical behavior is much more predictable. Just as one of the example, the physical behavior by the collective thoughts of mankind. If there's a straight frequency and alignment, you can affect natural phenomena emitting the positive unlikely events increase the probability of their occurrence. The power of priority that's to be good as evil. And even if they win their arguments about human nature, we can change that. That's Carr and the human brain is malleable. The brain's ability to reprogram itself and the flight to use. Or intellectual technology. Remember, brain takes on the qualities of those technologies. The rest are their rights about hating or it's actually bad. But I want you to drop down to their comments about the question of the life. First off, this is selfish. You should owe yourself to the other before you claim any form of value to life for yourself, because the other is always one that is always included, which is one that they do more against. You should try to protect them because it's pursuing your own value, because that is necessarily better than egoistic politics. And second, we access a better internal link to this question of value in the world. Militarism is pushing people to peripheries. The military industrial complex means that it makes it impossible to focus on things like structural violence. People who have been excluded from contemporary society because of the love for war, because of the militarization of society. You as an educator have a responsibility to deny the idea of war in the classroom. Giroux in 11, the universal transformative properties human resistance is accused. You crystallize civic movements will become community the broadest possible resistance. The active movements will connect the larger world through a conversation of all these linked predicted motivations of freedom of justice against the public like a machine. The expanding movement will necessarily for against the argument about the self-fulfilling prophecy is the other way. I think they are wrong in this question. All of our scientific data above disproves the thesis that science is on our side and on this question. They say that there's no root cause of war. That might be true, but that's not its reason. Like, we should relish in accepting war. It's the reason why our alternative should be aimed at surrender, to giving ourselves over to the other, giving ourselves over to the other. They've also conceded the thesis of our evidence that the idea of an archetype of war is necessarily valuable in. It's a discursive practice that war is only inevitable when you think that you shouldn't set hope for hope. Yeah.
Alright, so I'm just trying to get this scripture straight. Are your impacts predicated off Austin and I going out to the world and becoming policymakers?
It could be, yes. It's also just going out after this activity, right? The debate community also is part of our impacts. Like when we accept the idea that...
So what happens, I imagine Warren Brown, you say yes, and then I go out, like, I guess I'll be done with debate after this tournament, and I'll go be like a math major or something, and then what do I do? Like,
I don't know what you're going to do, but our Fairhurst evidence, our Wilcox evidence, and our Ulls evidence, our Arthur's evidence says that when we plan for war, it makes the war more likely. It makes us desensitized to those arguments. So I don't know if you will be in a position of power, but if you will, or even if you won't, your ability to, like, I don't know, argue for war or for militarism is bad. You should resist militarism in the debate space and out of the debate space. which is why we shouldn't be arguing for militarism and for war in a pedagogical space like debate.
Okay, is this, I just wasn't quite sure you changed the tags. Is this the tag you read?
I know that's not clear. I just said it's a state of exception. Like,
Okay.
the idea of
That's, I was right, I didn't hear that,
Okay,
so
yeah.
just trying to make sure.
totally.
Okay, on your car evidence, Carr is talking about how the plasticity of the human brain,
Yes.
as in when you do split brain experiments, when young children, the brain can go back, etc., etc. Why does that mean that our psyche can be changed?
He's also talking about how the brain's able to employ technologies. When he says technologies, he's in the context of discursive framings of things. And his argument is that when we begin to believe about one thing, right, it necessarily reinforces upon our existing beliefs. It makes us more likely to act in that way in the future. So if you necessarily take on the belief that nonviolence is a good and productive strategy to engage in the world, that will guide your actions in the future, right? Your brain will be more predisposed toward forms of nonviolence.
It seems to be talking about technology such as...
No, he means technologies you're right, he does say technology, but he's in the context of discursive arguments.
Then why is the article titled, "Is Google Making Us Stupid? What the Internet Is..."
Right, because we are reading, because the article's about reading like the internet, reading arguments, the same way that you would read arguments. When we speak arguments, it's the same thing of transferring information to us.
Walk.
Right, yeah. I don't know
Okay,
what the definition is. I don't know what that argument is. That argument is in the context of discursive and verbal techniques. Or it's not, but that's the way that we are using it this round. It's actually about
Right.
just information that is obtaining, through Google or things like that. That's my understanding of it. I didn't actually cut that all the way.
Okay, that's fine. If the judge votes for us, or say you being in this round, does that change what happens when you go out in the world?
Maybe. I think that we shouldn't support militarism in the debate space.
You need it.
Yeah. No, it's fine.
Right. Case, death toll. Case death toll.
Okay.
Grab some law offers.
Yeah, right there. Did you know Woodward SS is in a break round?
They want to what?
They're in a break round.
Really?
Yeah.
Could they list them?
Lexington and Greenhill.
Dang, I see. That's awesome.
Chico's good.
Which the Green Hill 18?
Yeah, that's you.
Revenge for NDCA, man. Twice.
Actually, they almost lost an ethics violation.
And they don't do that.
Yeah.
In this round? In that round?
Against Woodward.
Wow. Sorry, you said a case death call. 1 second. Let me just get
What was the objection?
Greenhill had done two things. They removed the returns and cut a debris card out of context, and then made the stuff that proved it was out of context 4-point font.
Who did that?
Greenhill.
I mean, it's
That's usually big practice in a way, almost. It's oh, this argument seems pretty good. It's just straight at the end.
Well, the thing was the reason why removing returns was bad is because the first paragraph said what they were talking about. The second paragraph was the proof that something solved, but they were not the same thing.
I mean,
at least they didn't identify a straw man without a paragraph break, just visually.
yeah. Right, sorry. You said case, then,
Case then death toll.
you got it.
Case we're not going over the Robinson argument. Their answers do not. Their Robinson answers do not apply to the McNabb test. Their framework for psychology is universal, exclusionary, and violent. Psychoanalysis is not something objective. Even that the psyche exists in the sense that it's an accurate way for describing some human psychology is fundamentally a discourse. But obviously, no body part called the psyche. It doesn't exist in the way that the brain exists. It's a schema for evaluating things. Our McNabb evidence says that it is ultimately exclusionary. It was created. It's a discourse created by the people and the levers of power. There are two objects. The first allows for people in power to rely on normalizing discourses of prescriptive mental health, to say that some people are not psychologically sane, to say that some psychological practices are normal. This leads the government to making discourses saying things that convince us to do things like go to war. A lot of people people into mental institutions. The second is the self-policing people who are psychologically outside of the norm, maybe people like gay people or people with other sorts of things would be considered deviation, are forced to police themselves, to try to force themselves in their mind to be different. This is a conceded value of life argument, which means that we were able to we outweigh necessarily all the cases of material arguments now. Yeah. Now, Arnold gives their arguments about the collective unconscious, even if they don't have a universal conception of the psyche, their ability to make blatant statements about the ontological state of human existence proves this. This proves their role of valid because just like this existence of the psyche, death call. They have functionally conceded a procedural argument, making this a pretty clear decision. They do not have a counter-interpretation. Our interpretation was that the question of this should be whether or not we're representing death in the simulation debate represents a valuable or harmful practice. They can't access the case without justifying their conclusion that death simulations are important. We control the offense. Our impacts stem directly from being forced to debate about death. Our impacts are missing the internal link between talking about death and materially fearing that you should default to competing interpretations because anything else is judged intervention. You have to decide between impossible thresholds. You just vote against us because we're friends with Max Anderson now. Some of the impacts here. One death called Botriarch's death games cause addiction to big impacts when, for example, debaters star cars with more deaths and get excited by the spectacle. Practicing this attitude fosters a death culture. Disable the worst violence in history. This is an internal link to 100% of the case because we devalue the deaths. We don't see the war in the way that they think that we should frame it as something that's glorious, but instead something that's meaningful, something that leads up to life is life. The second is death control. The focusing on controlling death is bad for games. Botriarch says this relation to control naturally neutralizes life by seeing people's lives as fiat has to be added up in administrative numbers game. The more we obsess over death and next less, we can see our own acts that hurt others outside of the debate game and outside of death, and we have over 80 studies that prove that this kind of form of debating causes mass violence. Solomon today. Mortality similarly once over more than 80 studies of this word, this debating one death momentarily sailing increases possibility result from the world is settling in the belief in violence about people with different beliefs like primary psychology study we respond by elevation. There are positive psychology not necessarily applied to this domain we respond to the specifics of our study. They are lots of different forms of positive psychology. This is only one of them. They're generic overarching claims do not apply, but simulating images of death and violence anesthetize this real doesn't produce a culture of structural violence makes infinite destruction appear desirable. Juro 314. The shooter was a monotony of images we play a lawyer after to save off the human fatigue that must be increasingly gory and shocking and otherwise intended to arouse any sentiments and all and your draw attention to local criminal violence is constantly rising higher grip on real violence and restore taking the representations of cruelty of the block the ability to respond politically and ethically the violence that's actually happening on the ground of the criminal violence as extreme images of torture, death, becoming violent and life criminal where familiar violence is barely recognized related only unnoticed and unnoticeable so the needs for more intensive images of violence accumulates moral difference in decentralization violence grows cruelty and suffering are often applauded for the outlets of seeking pleasure. They comment an argument why you should reject the argument, not the team, which means you necessarily have to reject even if they have other impacts besides that is not something that they can weigh because it's a procedural question, a question about the way we should debate in the first place, and all their impact claims are produced just by a constant state of domestic insecurity in the old is the voting negative is the only way to solve any of Juro 314. Acting on humans are now considered another form of entertainment design reason about the pleasure, quotient, relieving, then suffering of others, now registers across the board, social landscape, the statistic and most retrospectives of violence, brutality, the collection of professional widespread violence, now the functions part of an anti-immune system that turns a whole economy into genuine pleasure and mode, states that creates a foundation for having democracy, event equal to social and moral vitality until just the metaphysics of war violence, we think of all the American society of violence, people are practicing to become impossible to recognize, actively are not the alignment on these arguments do not make any sense in the context of our argument. These are all about Botriarch in the context of simulation and simulacra. This is not what we were just a question of the way that we orient ourselves to death, even in regards by Botriarch. You should not expect them to apply no new money arguments. This argument was very clearly tagged in the block, it was clearly flagged. Again, we issued the data as a procedural argument, which means you shouldn't allow them to accuse me of being shifty. I clearly was. You can call the text regards as they are politics matter again in the context of simulation and simulacra. They say that they the same thing, but they don't. The tags the one you see prove. They talk about war causing bad wars causing annihilation prove. They rely on this the currency of lives in the context of debate. This is that even if their arguments about there being some sort of reality are true, debate is not a reality. People die, but it changes the way we do things. What they say that what was I gonna say? They say that what they said is they read this last part of might be justification for death is in the context of Greek mythology. There's nothing in this art that makes any claims about Persephone tying that she didn't actually die, which means that a new application of this argument would be unwarranted.
Taking prep 647.
Robert's down 3.
stuff part we got to do.
That was part of it, yeah. Left.
Yes.
I guess seniors.
What?
I guess you're senior. What are you? Junior. Where are you going to college?
RV Mud College.
That's awesome. It's cool. Oh, it's California.
Was he the guy whose name was Mud? Like the Civil War guy, where it's like his name is Mud? That's where the expression comes from? Just like Harvey.
No.
Some guy named Mud did something
No,
bad.
Harvey Mudd was a dynamite magnet in 1910s.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Dynamite magnet.
Like a magnet.
Like he made his money off of selling dynamite.
Not like a.
Not like, not like he's not that good, no.
Well, it's gross.
Oh, man.
A human magnet, man.
What are you
Wow.
guys?
Yeah.
Oh, suddenly my stakes are a lot lower.
Is there like a green flow up there?
Oh, there's it's on the chair.
Oh, I remember, you screwed this down.
That didn't exist.
Our arguments were so bad.
No.
I was worried about your tip though. You were not.
No, that's
All right.
good.
The order is going to be case, decay, and death.
No, you're one of my ones.
I think I do. This.
Yeah, it is. Case, K death.
Yes.
Sounds right. Okay, sorry. Okay.
All right, everyone good?
Yep.
Okay. Their argument is like it doesn't make sense in the fact that they're conceding our corroborating 97 evidence, which specifically cites hundreds of different cultures that have had a relationship with Mars and had a psychoanalytical relationship with war, in which they see as a good thing. I don't think the Norse were abusing their power in a conspiracy to control their people. Lots of different societies have actually embraced war. They're also not directly addressing our difference in the Jungian difference between the conscious and the collective unconscious. Sure, on an individual level, we do have the ability to interact and control what we do, but there's also a collective unconscious that determines how we function as a society. Just because there's no body part that is the psyche doesn't necessarily mean it's not true. Two reasons here. The first is that there are scientific tests that prove we've done sublimation tests where people have unconscious word association. The second is that you might not like the word psyche, but there's also the soul. It's the part of humans that can't be explained. The reason why there's some things that we just can't explain about humans, and those exist. The psyche is just another word that Hillman uses in order to try and evaluate that different relationship. This isn't a reason why you should reject the team. It doesn't actually kill valuable life. In order for us to say that the psyche comes first, it's simply a fact that the psyche has to come first because it's a prerequisite. There was no answer to this in the 1 and C, and the new block arguments will justify new linear arguments go to the K. Way too many conceded arguments for them to go here first is that they say that we dropped the O, but we actually didn't. They say that vulnerability is accepting that one can be harmed in any given situation. That is what war is, accepting that you can be harmed directly. And they say they should celebrate surrender. That doesn't make sense. If we were to celebrate surrender, it wouldn't make us vulnerable because no one would attack someone who's surrendering. Instead, we should go to war. The only impact is about us relating to war in a bad way. But we solve by imagining bad things. That means that we don't want to go to war. Caroline and I don't want to go to war because of this affirmative. Instead, we can imagine bad things that would happen to us, and war means that we don't want to do it anymore. We don't think debate is a joke. We also want to avoid war. We're not part of the military-industrial complex. We're not going to be bad people because of this round. First of all, this argument is terminally non-unique because we ran this app since February. I think it would have done enough damage on our psyches, but it hasn't. Second, war is inevitable. They're conceding most of our wars here, including historical precedents, and the friend-enemy distinctions are good. It's not necessarily about decreasing violence, but it's about increasing respect, because when you have an enemy, Hillman says that you would respect him. And as far as their debate hurts girls argument, this is a term because we are both girls and we love war. We're self-changed the community because we're not construed as bitches just because of this app. At least I hope you don't think so. Examples he gives across as on war is not only examples he gives about war are bad. We defend Mars, which was without enslavement. He offers all examples of wars that would be traditionally bad things. Those are sanitized versus war. Iraq and Afghanistan, things like that, are versus war Hillman would not accept, and I will not actually cause war. We'd imagine this horror space, less likely to do it, and the hatred of war can never solve. We need to actually confront these things, and they drop that the alt can't solve because the human condition is one of violence. They also they just say an answer to failure to express our fears makes them true. They just say science is on our side. That's not necessarily true. And as far as the otherization stuff goes, we can't. It's a silly system. We can't function if you have to solve every other means that we would never focus on self. There's an infinite number of others that we would interact with. There's also no root cause to war. That means that we have to imagine it. Also, the stir evidence is pretty bad on this. They say the war is only inevitable when we think it is, but that's actually not not true. Our cautionary evidence and many pieces of our human evidence prove this. Also, they pretty much conceded that we solve the art because in war we do feel more vulnerable, and they also totally conceded the evidence she read from the book that without war the state is paranoid, and that's a bad thing. When we have war, it solves the state's paranoid delusions. They also pretty much concede that their alt won't solve because because one alt can't solve for decades of us in war. What? Oh yeah. Also, you should extend the perm here. The perm through both is going to be able to solve for this because it's that solves. Go on to that. Okay. First of all, we maybe don't understand this is a procedural argument, but you can't go to stats simply because we don't have counter-interpretation in a world where we meet their interpretation. We do justify our death talk as for the one I see. The entire thing is justifying the way that we understand these things because A, we're trying to actually avoid more deaths. Again, we don't simply use deaths as game pieces when we enter a vivid imagination of what that terror would feel like. We actually identify that. Second, Hillman says that in battle, warriors have more meanings instead of the state moving around pawns of people. They're actually warriors who have individual individual glory to them, and you should send out Baudrillard arguments they give us more credit than they say. First of all, he lumps psychology together, which is bad. Hillman is very different. This applies to the K2. It's archetypal psychology, which is a different form from the traditional psychoanalysis that they critique. The second is that Baudrillard endorses sort of a passive approach to things, which will eventually lead to extinction. Also, they're not giving enough credit to our beauty and death evidence. This is Persephone evidence. She read it from the book. It's pretty hard to miscall for the card. It's better than they say. It says that we must enter into death in order to a firm life. We have to confront the god of death, which is what our imagination do. You should also weigh the loss of the soul on top of this. They ignore the point of the after point where they're not answering our Davis evidence. You should also crossify from the K that failure to face our fears makes them actually lash out. And we admit that the perm doesn't work here, but you can still look at this argument, not necessarily a perm, but look at the fact that we can do both. We can do the app and reject the image of death. That we both function on the same in-round level of impacts, which means that if they would actually just imagine how terrible it would be, they would no longer see death as a joke. 517.
Oh, yeah, sorry, this. Okay, sorry. Give me the agency that's on here.
And the whole block is
Yep.
in there somewhere.
Thank you.
No,
I
I
have
said
that you have 9
10.
seconds left.
Oh, just give me 1 second.
No, you don't know. Just kidding. That'd be fun.
Here's going to be the criticism that called the case. Alright. Ready? Alright. There's a concessionary program, which I think is a true argument that who we are in this activity becomes who we are later in life. Our program talks about a debater who's been in activity for a long time. She expresses her disbelief that the person that she is in debate is not becoming who she's like. The practices that she employs are the practices that employs for her life between all the arguments about, oh, we are just planning for the future. We're just imagining why war is so bad necessarily. If we win the thesis that an imagining of war, that celebration of war necessarily makes more likely or more deadly, or is so in line with militarism, you should vote negative because their project necessarily spilled over. You have one that's a consequence. Now they've conceded, or Campbell Everett said the view of war, may something be celebrated as those tactics of modern state politics, where we assume that populations can be mobilized for the sake of war, which means this is ended by the internal nature of their war arguments. They have also conceded the focus on large impacts that was characterized as the death cult flow as the tag of the talk has said, quote, annihilation ignores status quo subject, which was our Giroux evidence we have, and turning to structural violence, which should necessarily because if you celebrate war, you should also celebrate the costs of war, which are famine and hunger, and the people that are left at the sidelines of your policies who simply say that we should continue to suffer. They make the argument that war is something more than means to achieve vulnerability, that no one would attack those who surrender. That is necessarily not true. Your love of war necessarily that you will attack those that do surrender. We also distance to the ideas of embracing war necessarily, which means that there's only a chance that the form of relishing war leads to our debates. Now the crux of our argument, imagining war does not solve war. It makes it more likely. The permutation is new in the one area. You should reject it. But more importantly, we have dissent to the permutation, which is their imagining of war. Their the first is our theory of evidence. It says that psychological priming, when we begin to think of scenarios in which there's going to be a war, it makes us more likely to associate them. When we hear war, when we hear politics, political strategy, necessarily overlap them. And this is entirely consistent with their arguments about the psyche, because it proves that even if there is an unconscious, the result of that unconscious is to make the connections that war is something that is preferable, and as an we talk to politics, which means they make war more like the second is our force evidence, which was conceded that humans emit waves as a collective. This is a dissent to scenario planning, because it says that thinking of the scenario just compounds the risk. It gives the example of the power of prayer, and that actually makes things more likely, because we say that we are praying for something to happen. What that actually does is it makes us less likely to act on it, because we think we are stopping for either the visioning of war to stop war. It actually makes it more likely that they engage in the process of war making, to make the extension, We also conceded on the death cult flow, or Butcher evidence, it says their idea of playing the game to make necessarily using the body counts plays that sanitize themselves to death, where they no longer think death is a bad thing. The idea of voting affirmative within their game-like idea of psychology necessarily to preventing war proves necessarily why the affirmative is a bad idea. They make the argument of the Friendly Distinction. They conceded origami evidence about how the thesis of the Friendly Distinction presupposes the idea of a sovereign able to make the same exception in calculations that are disposable. They say that there are certain type versions of war. War is always bad. They could not name a counterexample, and the only one they did was the Gallic War, which you said is necessarily resulted in the mass slaughter of lots of populations, the destruction of the destruction of human life, and also resulted in lots of death, and necessarily the enslavement of the Gallic people, which means that is something that you should have to defend. If that is the only example, do not let the two ever come up and need new examples, because it would be possible to break war. It's always war, so it's necessary bad. Now, war is not inevitable. They conceded. The thesis of our Bushcraft and science is on our side of this question that war is just a discourse that is often used. We say that war is inevitable, but actually, if you look at the genes of the attributes with the genes of human, it's less likely we are able to move to a form of peaceful relations. There's nothing encoded in our genes to make us competitive. They've also conceded the thesis of our wet evidence in the context of the Cold War that if we change the manner in which we describe the other, it's no longer threatening and allows us to engage peaceful relations, which is why our alternative is good. It gives yourself over to surrender, to embrace your vulnerability policy, which is a universal human condition, which instead of accepting war, instead of celebrating war, you celebrate the fact that you are vulnerable, that is necessarily bad. They make the extension over called not responsive to our further. That's why we win the thesis debates over. I mean, that's a reason to vote negative. Not just helpful. Only going to answer your argument about entering into death, human life vulnerability necessarily solves that because it recognizes the universal human condition of being vulnerable. There's only a chance that they're imagining and thinking war makes the impact more likely. Now, the case debate, the McNay debate, their conception of a stable human psychology is bad. It's collective unconscious, it's exclusionary bad. It justifies the violent regimes of the power of people with their hands on those of power to make arguments about people, i.e. the idea that it is only natural necessarily to be a straight person, not a gay person. This leads to microfascism and internally turns all of it like arguments because people begin to hate themselves. They want to become normal, which is even if they win the argument that something else is true, you should not privilege that in your decision.
357.
Hey Nathan, take that gun down. She likes wine.
That won't be necessary. I'm sorry, I was talking about Austin.
Okay.
Yeah. So the case then critique, and I just kind of put the Baudrillard, death arguments down the flow as we're going, so that'll just be harder. If that's okay with you.
Yeah, that's where I am. So that works out.
Okay.
Hold on, sorry. My cake was. It's kind of.
Is that it? No.
No, NIA.
Well, here.
Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
First one, Casey doesn't get to this flow enough time to do your work out his argument. Aren't the reason why you should reject our framework there. We have several reasons why the psyche is necessarily real, and that's why you should prefer that there. Has a huge emphasis on scientific evidence, which means you should prefer that the psyche. We have evidence that the psyche is real science. You have evidence scientific studies that have been done. Look at subliminal brainwave, subliminal messages, and look at the brainwaves of the scan to prove that the psyche is indeed real. The psyche is real and it influences everything. That means it influences everything we do on a subconscious level, which means we have to look at the psyche. We have to know how we relate to the psyche, which means your balance strategy signify the best way to relate to the psyche. The only reason they say projector framework is because we try to put people into boxes. We have some they're getting the distinction between the two types of conscious. There's some things that are collective conscious, but there are entire affirmative is a way we can change. We can interpret and change our relationship to the collective conscious by setting and rejecting and putting it aside being a pretty basic. We also have the individual conscious. Human advocates looking into the conscious return and to figure out what's there and loving and embracing what the individual soul presents between them. And none of these arguments apply. We win our framework that psyche first. The way you interpret around means to try our guide for the affirmative. We have been extending our Davis impact here. The entirety of the round we have the psyche raffle fair and to preserve our psychological health makes us less more and use more violence out in the future. He once again gives the example of Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs as the way to end war lashes as a result enter into our psyche. You don't have an impact to vote negative. The only impact in this round is the affirmative because their impact is trying to get it lost and going out into the world and becoming a strategist in the Pentagon or the political leaders, which is neither accessing vulnerability, when we enter into the archetype of Mars, when we enter into this archetype of affirmative battle and affirmative love for battle, that's when we feel that it most vulnerable. Not when we take a step back from the world and ignore what is going on around us. Instead, we feel more vulnerable when we're out in the battlefield and glorified in the battlefield. He says, next, that means that the permutation will solve. He says, this is new. Is definitely not. It was definitely in the two AAC. He says plenty of reasons why we shouldn't have new AR arguments. You definitely are streaming into new two arguments between the permutation is going to solve and resolve the entirety debate, because you shouldn't allow new arguments. Additionally, the permutation would resolve all the links we would enter into imagination of battle, but we also had to feel and recognize the vulnerability we feel, why we were entered into that battle, which makes us less likely to want to go to battle, makes us less likely to want to go to the battle in the future. The future only thing he tries to say, and here's finding this as a psychological concept doesn't even apply to methods of war studies. Studies have been on it once again. We resolve the link. There's also a couple of net benefits for the permutation. First is that they can see that the psyche is naturally violent. There, parts of brain plasticity are talking about how the clock has changed our sleep patterns, not about whether you can change the collective unconscious or not. We have a few pieces, all our human evidence and pieces of evidence talk about how the ontological and psychological addition of humans is naturally violent, which means that we have to enter into war, and that we have to look at their suffering. I'll answer their death argument here. We need to enter. Once again, we need to enter into that. This is the best way to enter into vulnerability. That's what our perception is talking about, which you can only do by imagining war, not by taking a step back, which means so better. They say war is inevitable. We've been answering this. If they're so focused on appearance, they should look to the last 5,000 years of recorded history. That there have been 2 to 3 wars for each year, which means that it's inevitably great in our culture. If we win that is war is inevitable. It's only a question of how we relate to. It's only a question of how we relate. It's only a question of how we relate to women, which means we have the best psychological approach to resolution.
Yeah. Well, there's things like that.
I get to be the scholar.
Nice thoughts.
Good job. You're the ToC and whatnot, and I'm sure you'll get a lot of that. I'm more sincere than that, but that's going to take up a lot of your time later. I vote negative. I think this debate is interesting in a couple of ways. I think, first of all, that this question of whether or not stable human psyches are good or bad becomes largely irrelevant. There's not like another method for me to evaluate the debate. I think that you could have potentially, like, you say something at the very end of the ToC that could have potentially helped you, or been developed into something different about how even if it's true that they're like real or inevitable, that I don't have to decide the round in a certain way. And I think that you could be like, look, even if your framework for the round has to be our relationship to our psyche or our investigation of our psychic relations or whatever, you can be like, if I win this argument, just don't ever stabilize that, right? Like, anytime that they make an argument that assumes a stable human psyche, just cross it off your flow because it's bad and violent, right? Just tell me to do that. Like, because then you can be like, there's a version of their framework that allows this argument to sort of jive, you know what I mean? Or at least, I mean, maybe there's not one that Hillman would agree with, you know what I mean? But,
Yeah.
right. On security proper. First of all, I think that the alternative also becomes very secondary. There's not much of a challenge to this characterization that, like, we can experience vulnerability in the battlefield. And as a sidebar, part of my problem with this and evaluating, and part of why it takes me so long, is something that I have in relation to psychoanalysis and like a problem that I have with how to evaluate it, which is that, like, I fundamentally believe that you may both be right at the same time. Like, you may be able to experience vulnerability on a battlefield, but the notion, like, but you may understand the battlefield as being all about, like, securing yourself. And hell, maybe we can experience, like, a secure, like, egoistic, like, prideful valorization of violence and still feel vulnerable at the same time. What I'm not sure of, in terms of the critique, is why vulnerability breaks down security. But in terms of the affirmative, that means that I'm not sure why it gets you out of the affirmative impacts to say that we can access vulnerability. Because it seems like the rest of the debate is imagining war bad. And I think that, like, what I'm not getting from you either on the permutation about how you access vulnerability is, like, why does the fact that we can be vulnerable on a battlefield mean that it's a good idea to, either that it's a good idea to imagine war, or that security goes away after we have that battle and feel vulnerable, or imagine having that battle and imagine feeling vulnerable. I'm not connecting your alternative to security to your indict of imagining war. And that seems like a problem for the negative, and I'll talk about, right. But I don't think that they necessarily needed an alternative in this round because of the way the framework works, and just because I think that if they win with the imagining of, and because I think that you're behind on the spillover, I guess that's kind of a shitty way to describe it, but they make these arguments about how our psyche affects the way that we act in the world, and it seems like that that explanation is in contest with Hellman's analysis about why imagining war would mean that I don't go to war. You want to tell me at certain points that it almost sounds like you want to say we would describe something to ourselves so horrific that we would never go and do it, right? But I don't think that's actually your advocacy, or if it is, it's in contest with things that you say the Norse version of war is a good one. You know, if you advocate a certain version of violence, just be upfront about that and don't make it sound like we're going to show ourselves a horror movie that makes us avoid violence. I'm not sure how your method solves security or the way that we relate to war now, is I guess what I'm saying. I don't get a consistent message from you on that basis. And so it's almost like I vote neg on a case turn. Because like I said, I don't totally understand why vulnerability is even really that relevant. A couple of things I'll say in particular about the line by line. As soon as I find them. Oh, your 2AR strategy, I think, is also confusing. Maybe I flowed it differently than you, but my understanding of the perm and the 1AR was the part at the end of the security flow where you were extend the perm and then sort of paused and you were it solves, now moving on. Do we all remember that moment in the debate? That was my extension of the perm. And if I fucked that up, then I fucked it up. But I mean, I thought it was fairly clear at the bottom. So then when you're in the 2AR being maybe he misflowed it, I didn't actually drop it, that's technically true, but at the same time, I'm sitting here sort of surprised that you're going to go all in on 4 words or whatever, you know. So that being said, I think that cuts against me giving you the benefit of the doubt on combining imagining war with what I think the negative is explaining is the criticism of that. I mean, I can talk. I think it's less clear that your original 1NC links about or not, maybe not 1NC links is the way to describe them, but your links to things like Baudrillard and body counts and this stuff about warplane scenarios, making things war planning, you know? I think you're very close with that. What I was originally going to say was I think that's less clear than later in the debate when you're sort of talking more about the debate space than about war planning. I think that you're close because I think the argument that you would make is similar, but it almost sounds like you want to make the future policymakers argument as part of your spillover argument. You want to be look, they think war is good, so we shouldn't probably encourage that in the people that are going to go run the country. But fuck what they do out in their lives, right? Just be we don't think that you should think violence is good. In the debate community, if your argument from whatever that was, Kirk or whatever, is true that me thinking that Norse violence would affect the way that I act in the world, that might not mean that I'm going to go rape and pillage, right. But it might mean that I may be more willing to accept those sorts of, things like that. Oh, I totally forgot to talk about the structural violence argument, but I think that you guys should articulate it more offensively as a trade-off argument to the permutation because it's not clear how it interacts with the perm, but I also don't think that there's really any discussion of structural violence with the affirmative. Totally forgot what I was just saying. Oh, dude, and I mean, as much as you jump over the Gall example, like, just do it again with the Norse example, because I think it's almost worse, right?
Yeah.
It's almost, because in the Gall example, I can sort of rationalize how, when she's like, yeah, the slavery thing is like a consequence after the war, you can be like, dude, the Norse version of war is literally go to your land, take your stuff, rape your women. Genocidal rape, right? Like, and I mean, that's probably not the part of it that Hillman wants to talk about. He probably wants to talk about like eye-to-eye, like physical combat, as opposed to like gunfire and things like that. But it puts you in a good spot in the debate when you can make the example seem like a poor one. You guys can ask questions in the interim. I'm still just sorting through notes that I have randomly positioned on my flow.
I was just wondering, had there been more on the permutation in the 1AR? Would that have been viable, or was the rest of the so turns about imagining violence so disconnected from the alternative that it wouldn't have?
I mean, I think that if there's like your case debate, I think is the best part of the 2AR because I see like the biggest point of contention in this round as essentially the two pseudo spillover claims that are being made. Because there's not really a whole lot of like there's the Davidson evidence that's extended, but like in terms of descriptions of non-material impacts and why they're important, like value to life or like discursive violence or things like that, onslaught, whatever, I'm not really sure how to evaluate that or situate that in the round. But I do think that he's being more thorough and explanatory and talking like for instance with that card that Eric was before Kirk or whatever it is. Thank you. In explaining how like repeatedly believing something or how we process information and things like that can lead over into action. I think that your competing claim on this is the one that you make on the case today about how you can. The conclusion of this is going to be that I don't understand yours clearly. Yes, so we advocate looking into the individual consciousness. Oh, yeah. I like how the archetype like stops the distinct or escalation or whatever. I don't understand your solvency, I guess, at the end of the round is what I'm trying to get at. Because it seems like the challenge that the turn makes to your imagining is that like it would create material violence in the real world. And so the part that you need to just like have that moment of clarity on is the part where you explain why the imagining disrupts that, right? I think that you, well, A, don't do that on the critique obviously because you're going through permutation, but like for the broader part of the round, don't, like I have that note as part of the 2AC, like that should be the sort of slow down, stop, and be like, look, this is essentially a giant challenge to the solvency of our method. So like, distinctions between like what large scale and limited war are and like how you're able to change what may or may not be an immutable consciousness at either an individual or collective level, change our actions in addition to, you know what I mean, like has some implication on the material. Like, that happens a little bit in the cross-sects, but, like, I'm left unclear, like, even, like, when you say, for instance, the Norse example, like, is that because of the technology that they use, their proximity to their enemies, their behavior during combat, their attitude or relationship toward war? Like, but if that's all it takes, then it doesn't make sense to me that any of those other factors would be relevant. Like, if SEAL Team 6 has your attitude toward war,
well, yeah, the thing with the Norse example, which I...
Well, my broader point is that I don't know what the vision of, like, good war is, and so, or where the, like, what the relevant distinctions are, like, why are guns bad, or, like, why is distance bad, or whatever, you know?
Right.
And that affects how I believe that your relationship to war affects actions in the world. You know, like, if I'm not clear on that vision, then it's going to be hard for me to translate that into how you affect, like, my behavior.
Right.
Things like that.
Why I said this is like, I know it's kind of inconsequential, but why I said the thing with the Norse was because they made the argument that like, you know, when you talk about psyche as something that applies to everyone, I was saying like, well, the piece of evidence mentions that like, even the Norse associated the planet Mars with their war god. I was saying that because they had that psychological approach, I don't think they were trying to like have a political experiment where they moved their, you know, civilians as troops and the kind of stuff that they were talking about, where they sort of just like send in waves of unnamed people and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it effectively provides a counterexample to like war planning is necessarily biopolitical, but I mean, it does like.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was effective there. I just thought it was sort of like a dangerous example, but I mean, I guess you're kind of all about that when you're saying war's good. Right.
You're living a dangerous example.
Yeah, you're essentially going to be probably better at explaining those distinctions than I am. I think the truest thing that anybody says on the issue of the like immutability of the psyche or whatever is the 1AR, when she's like, there's something in humans that is inexplicable to science and rationality. And I mean, that does defy a lot of your attempts to sort of like calculate and perfectly know the mind. But I also, in certain ways, and I think that you should call them on this, think that it cuts against certain notions of at least a univocal or deterministic collective unconscious, because they're, you know, this distinction that they try to make on the inevitability.
Yeah.
Unless their point is that like there are parts of individuals that aren't explicable by rationality in science, but that doesn't necessarily translate to the collective, you know, that like the collective acts personally or acts rationally or something. That doesn't seem right.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think there were a lot of points in this debate where there were potential inconsistencies on both sides of the opposite.
Yeah, can you just clarify something? I'm sure you explained this, but you said you voted on a case term. Like, what, or kind of, you know, like you said,
Yeah, all I meant by that is that the way that the K debate plays out, I don't think the alternative is necessary, because the framework is just like the best relationship to the psyche or war or whatever, and that it's like in some ways they referendum your like imaginary. They're like, look, we think their imaginary has bad consequences, and so like I can sort of vote you down without an alt. Like your imaginary was bad, right?
Right, so like the argument.
I guess I called it a case turn. I just meant like.
No, but the argument you voted on
right?
is like, like imagining war as good makes us in turn, you know, think that in real life, and you know, not necessarily for policymakers, but just like you said earlier, then that's like a bad way to relate to things in the debate space in your life, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think they make the two pieces of specific argumentation that I'm referring to are. I'm not even going to try to cite this evidence a third time, I'm sorry. But the one that's about the debate community where there's a person sort of reflecting on the way that information and sort of knowledge practices have changed their behavior in the world. But then there's also this example about the Cold War and about the way that like discourse has effects on like material politics, you know. And if those things are both true, then your attempt to sort of sidestep the issue of like war being, violence being imagined doesn't make as much. Like it seems like the sort of defensive link out that like we're not actually going to go to war becomes less persuasive if they can link it to your material, like behavioral actions in your life, even if it's not, even if those actions aren't necessarily like political in the sense that you're controlling our military or something like that.
Yeah.
They can still be violent at a local level, I guess.
Sorry, just one last
And I mean, if the framework is our relationship to our psyche, then like violence, I think, is bad. Or maybe it's good, but the distinction as to where I draw that line could have been leveraged more offensively. Also, I think the 2AC like attitude on the critique could have been radically different. Like, the schedule flow. You make the argument several times by reading cards that say a couple of different things, mostly more common evidence, about like their attempts to extinguish peace from the world are actually what create more violence. But you're not super explicit about like the critique is an example of that. that the affirmative has initially. What's up? I did not attend the low point.
No, we need to break these ties with this system. You can't have.
I can't have two debaters get the same speaker points? I'm sorry.
No problem.
Which one's?
I know that thing.
Just
Yeah,
make
it's,
27. That's
he
what-
tied it for 30.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Drop those points.
I lost track of where was that there. What were we talking about?
Oh, she just had one more question.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, if they say that the alternative resolves these kind of case turns, would permutation, like, I know you said it was shorter than 1 AR, but theoretically, would a permutation resolve that?
Okay, yeah, this would have been interesting. If like, I might have voted affirmative if the 2AR had explained the negative alternative to me in that way. You know what I mean? Like, that's confusing, I know, but like, the reason that I don't really evaluate vulnerability is because I don't know how it interacts with disrupting the military-industrial complex or violence in our lives or the link level of the debate. But in this framework, I don't see that kind of alternative as necessarily necessary because I just sort of decide which one of you better like psychically relates to violence or war or just to your own like consciousness or whatever. So yeah, I think if the 2AR is able to be like, look, we don't have much on the perm, but what we do have is that you can experience vulnerability on the battlefield. Here's why that means we don't actually create material violence, but that would require you to then explain like why vulnerability breaks down violence, which I don't understand at this point in the round. Which is why I'm like, I don't think this all really interacts with this critique. I'm sure it does, by the way. I know that it does with the Butler evidence. Just saying, like, for the purposes of this round.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Good round. Was the 2 and C the right idea? And was
Yeah.
it just badly executed?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I don't think I think you should have chosen in the block between, like, yes, no, death roll.
Okay.
Because, yeah, that would have resolved that issue. You could have had them take care of it in the 1 and R, I think.
Okay.
And I think they're super similar. Like, do the 2 and R move in the 2 and C where you're like, this is just a link, basically.
Okay, yeah.
Right.
Like,
Or don't do it and just go for that.
okay, okay.